We'll get four reactions now to what Robert McNamara just said, as well as what he wrote and did. Senator John McCain, Republican of Arizona, was a Navy pilot and prisoner of war in the Vietnam conflict. He just returned from a trip to Vietnam.
Well, Bill Clinton, as I understand it, had a high draft number finally and wasn't called. The people who didn't and who protested, I respect them too, but I believe that we all have an obligation to serve our government or take the penalty, take a jail sentence if we violate the law.
Well, Robert McNamara, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll get four reactions now to what Robert McNamara just said, as well as what he wrote and did. Senator John McCain, Republican of Arizona, was a Navy pilot and prisoner of war in the Vietnam conflict. He just returned from a trip to Vietnam. George McGovern was a senator from South Dakota and Democratic presidential nominee in 1972. McGeorge Bundy was National Security Advisor to Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. He's now with the Carnegie Corporation in New York. Robert Scheer, a columnist for the New York Times now, was a founding editor of the anti-war magazine Ramparts. George McGovern, what do you think of Mr. McNamara's explanation for why he remained silent until now?
Well, I don't accept the doctrine that there's no place for a principled resignation in the American governing system. This has happened numerous times. I remember clearly when Elliot Richardson resigned as Attorney General rather than to carry out a policy in the Nixon administration that he thought was wrong. Having said that, I want to say that I'm glad that Mr. McNamara wrote this book. I think it helps clarify the historical record when one of the chief architects of the war has the courage to say, however late in the day, and it's awfully late, I was wrong. I had doubts about it at the time. I wish we had never gotten into Vietnam. We haven't heard that yet from Henry Kissinger, who was a key architect of this policy for years after Mr. McNamara left office. Silence from the Kissinger-Nixon camp, who must have known by early 1969 that we should terminate that war.
Senator McCain, are you glad Robert McNamara wrote this book?
Not particularly. I think that what has been studied and learned about this issue is pretty well covered again. I believe that it's important for us to try to put to rest and behind us the division and the terrible tragedies associated with the war, and I think that Mr. McNamara's book contributes little. It's 25 years too late, and frankly, we don't need it. I also agree with Senator McGovern about principled resignations. I remember that Cyrus Vance resigned over a foreign policy disagreement, but in case Senator McGovern has not read Henry Kissinger's book, Diplomacy, their role and their rationale for the way they extracted us from that quagmire is well documented.
Oh.
Senator McCain, if I could just make a quick observation on that. I went to see Mr. Kissinger in March of 1969 at the White House. I had known him before he was appointed by Mr. Nixon, and I said something like this to him: Henry, you folks are not responsible for this war. You've just won an election. You've come into office on a statement that you had a plan to end the war. Why don't you simply announce this war was a mistake and terminate our involvement there? He didn't say the war was worthwhile. What he said is that the domestic political situation wouldn't permit that there'd be an upheaval on the part of Mr. Nixon's major backers and across the country, and that because of domestic political realities that had nothing to do with the realities in Vietnam, we had to stay the course for a time.
Senator McCain, on that quick answer, and then we're going to come back to McNamara. Okay?
Sure. We're not here to debate Henry Kissinger, but the fact is that in his book he states, and I agree with him, that we had to get out, but we had to get out with some kind of order, and we had to get out in a way that would minimize U.S. casualties and not have some kind of rush to the port. So the fact is there was domestic considerations, but I think that most military experts, which clearly Senator McGovern is not, would say that it was a difficult situation, and the way we extracted ourselves was the best out of a bad situation. May I quickly add, Senator McGovern touts his support of the American military men. I saw him on another program. Senator McGovern, those of us in prison did not appreciate it when you said you would go to Hanoi on your knees. We were trying to stay on our feet.
Senator McCain, if George McGovern's policies had prevailed, you wouldn't have been in prison in Vietnam, and we wouldn't have had 58,000 young Americans dead in Vietnam.
Robert
Senator
Scheer.
McGovern, if you had been president, I'd probably still be there.
Robert Scheer, we just heard Robert McNamara say that he hoped that the writing of his book would help, would serve a useful purpose based on just this exchange we've just heard between Senators McGovern and McCain. Is Vietnam too big a sore to ever be cured?
No, I think there are important lessons. Let me just correct it, by the way. I write for the Los Angeles Times, not the New York Times.
Did I say New York Times? My apologies.
I think the book is a very important one, and I think it's important because it shows how little knowledge, the abysmal ignorance that was present in the government at that time. First of all, there were senators, Gruning and Morse and Church, who were saying all these things that McNamara now says he didn't know, that Ho Chi Minh was an Asian Tito, that there was a Sino-Soviet dispute. I mean, the Russians and Chinese have been firing at each other on their border in 1960. The United States government had prevented the Geneva Accords. We prevented it precisely because we were afraid Ho Chi Minh would win the election. Eisenhower predicted he would win the election. We installed Diem in power, this autocrat who McNamara says he detested as an autocrat and later we had killed as the so-called democratic alternative. We knew he wasn't a democratic alternative. Anyone who read Graham Greene's novel in 1955 would have known this whole exercise was absurd. We were blundering into another people's history. And it's amazing to me to read this book, and I've read it very carefully, to see, A, how little knowledge there was in the administration when they came in, and B, when they got the knowledge, it didn't seem to affect their actions. I mean, the startling thing about this book is that, that McNamara says he knew all this as early as 1965, and yet the war continued for 10 years. And I want to make one comment on Kissinger, who, if there is a bigger fraud than McNamara in this respect, it's certainly Henry Kissinger, who continued this war for another 7 years, extended it to Cambodia, when he says that it was not necessary and he was trying to get out. And we keep mentioning the casualties. I think before the program ends, we should mention that there were 3 million Vietnamese who also died in this war. This is one of the major massacres in history. And I don't think we should just sit around in this very genteel way and say, well, you know, he did the duty. I think he was complicitous both in action and through silence, and that McNamara bears a serious responsibility along with Kissinger for a lot of those deaths.
Does Robert McNamara assume the responsibility correctly in his book, Mr. Scheer?
No, I don't think so. I think the book is interesting in that it shows us that the best and the brightest did not read and did not think very clearly. It makes one suspicious of any government official, and I think should lead the citizens to question what they're told is the official truth. But I don't find any sense of contrition in this book. I think it's a bit cold-blooded in its rhetoric. There's no real sense of the lives that were lost, the damage to this country, the people who in the American military who were killed or were kept prisoner, the Vietnamese who died. I don't find any great, it's not an important piece of literature in that respect. We don't really have an example of a man wrestling with his soul. What we have, I think, is someone dissembling and trying to put the best spin on what is really an atrocious complicity. He should have resigned. He should have resigned earlier, and he should have criticized the war. And I agree with Senator McGovern, who was a strong critic of the war, that this would have saved many millions of lives.
McGeorge Bundy, is that what do you read? Do you agree with Mr. Scheer that what this is all about is Robert McNamara trying to put a spin on a bad situation?
I think he's trying to tell it as straight as he knows how. He obviously isn't going to see it the way Mr. Scheer does, and I myself don't read the book as Mr. Scheer does or history as he does, so obviously I'm not going to reach his conclusions. I think Bob McNamara has tried very hard to tell it as he now understands it, and you can quarrel with or differ with his interpretations, but I think it's an honest contribution and it will be a very much valued one.
What about Mr. Scheer's point about and Mr. McNamara spoke of it too, about not having the right information? Scheer says that, you heard what he said, that information was available. Mr. McNamara said that it was not. What was your experience about getting information, what the situation really was as far as the war was concerned?
There was plenty of information. There was too much. in the sense that, as people often used to remark, you would talk to different people coming back from Vietnam and you'd feel that they'd been to different countries. So it was a very serious problem of analysis and of judgment, and there is more to be said on both sides than we've heard or have time for this evening. I think myself that our failure was in failing to estimate the imbalance, just in straight power terms, on the scene in Vietnam. Without being for or against either side, the evidence now is clear, and the evidence then was more clear than most of us in the government recognized, that there was an underlying imbalance in which the odds were strongly in favor of a victory by the North Vietnamese.
Do you agree with Robert McNamara's conclusion that that he and the others there in the Johnson White House were wrong, terribly wrong, and would you accept that yourself?
Sure.
Without question?
I think it's very unlikely that we were right, looking at the evidence as we now have it, of the extraordinary determination and persistence and readiness for sacrifice and skill in both political and military campaigns that were demonstrated by the North Vietnamese.
Yeah. George McGovern, what about Robert Scheer's point that he didn't see contrition in the words or even the tone of Robert McNamara, and should there been more there?
I think I saw more contrition and regret than my friend Bob Scheer did. There are a couple of things that bother me, though, about Mr. McNamara's explanation. One is his statement that they didn't have the experts inside the government that they needed because of the McCarthy period had driven them out of government. But there were other sources of information, people like Walter Lippmann, people like David Halberstam, people like Senator Fulbright, Senator Mansfield, and others who spelled out all of these things that Mr. McNamara now says are lessons he learned belatedly. There's another question that bothers me about Mr. McNamara's explanation of why he didn't speak out. He said under our system, he thought he had an obligation to be faithful to the president, the elected president who named him to office. But even after Mr. McNamara left office, left the Department of Defense, this war continued for another 5 years, and he said nothing during that period. 40% of all the Americans who died in Vietnam died after Mr. McNamara left his office. Why didn't he speak out at that point?
Senator McCain, what is your view about Mr. McNamara's decision not to resign with a public protest and not to speak out until now?
Well, I think clearly he should have resigned at the time, and I think that, but I must caveat that by saying I think that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who also knew that this war was being conducted in a way that there was no way that there could be a victory, should have resigned as well. I think military men in particular have the option, when they disagree with national policy and know that it's wrong, to resign. I think both groups should have, and perhaps around 1965 we could have avoided the debacle. If I could I'd strongly disagree with Mr. Scheer's history of the war, and I would point out that after this conventional attack in 1975, when the North Vietnamese overwhelmed South Vietnam, thousands were executed, hundreds of thousands put in re-education camps, and millions voted with their feet. Not exactly the result that Mr. Scheer and others who protested the war predicted.
What do you think, Senator McCain, of Robert McNamara's answer to Robin's question about how those who protested the war should be considered now?
I cherish the right to demonstrate against the policies of one's government. I think it's one of the things that we fight for, and still isn't true in the case of Vietnam and many other countries. But at the same time, they should have no doubt as the effect that it had on the morale of the North Vietnamese. Ho Chi Minh in 1966 said, "We won't win the war in the battlefields of South Vietnam. We'll win it in the streets of Chicago, San Francisco, and New York." And he was correct. But at the same time, I would rather have that right cherished and lose a war than suppress it.
Oh. Mr. Scheer, what do you think Robert McNamara's book does for, does it vindicate those who protested against the war? The president and his press secretary said that last week. Do you agree with that?
I do. First of all, to say that Ho Chi Minh was a Tito does not mean he was a Democrat. Tito was not a Democrat. He was a nationalist communist who was broke with the Soviet Union. And the whole history of Vietnamese communism would have led you to believe that they would have broke with the Chinese and the Russians, and that's what happened. We lost the war in Vietnam, and instead of what the hawks predicted, Vietnam and China went to war. The dominoes did not tumble. In fact, these two communists, one of was supposed to be the puppet of the other, had a very bloody war. And right now we have both of these countries turning to capitalism. So this war that could not be lost, in fact, when it was lost, resulted in countries that are not the least bit threatening to the United States at this time, and in fact are busily signing contracts with American corporations. I also want to make the point, I don't want to dump on McNamara alone as if he did this war alone. He didn't. The United States got involved under the Eisenhower administration when we decided not to honor the Geneva Accords and prevent a free election. You have a guest on your program, George Bundy, who is certainly as complicit as McNamara, and I don't know why McNamara should take all the heat. And I think there, by the way, I think points raised in this book, I think it's a very important book and should be read. There are all sorts of intriguing points, one of which is the Gulf of Tonkin, which involved a matter of lying to the United States Congress to get the closest to a declaration of war that they had. If you read the McNamara chapter carefully, he says there that it's possible that the attack didn't happen.
Let's give Mr. Bundy an opportunity.
Let me just say that he admits that there were cables from the captain of the ship urging that attack not take place, and that President Johnson rushed to get on television, and that McNamara then told Admiral Sharp out in the Pacific, we have to go because the president wants to go on television.
Yeah. You agree with that history, Mr. Bundy?
Not precisely, but it's on an important point. And it is certainly true that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was seized by the president as a time for him to take his resolution on Vietnam to the Congress, and he made that decision and arranged that broadcast before there was really absolutely clear-cut evidence as to what had happened out there, and I think that was a mistake. And I remember the episode very strongly, clearly, because I can remember saying to the president as he came back and said, I'm going to make a speech and we're going to take the resolution up, that we ought to wait. And he said, I didn't ask you that. I told you to help me get organized. So he did make a quick decision on an incompletely verified event. That something happened, that there was some attack, one, as Bob McNamara says in his book, and possibly two, rather than two clear-cut ones. That's probably true in my view, although I've never made the kind of exhaustive study that would allow me to be sure. Let me say one more thing.
Yes, sir.
And that is that the real problem about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is that it was later misused. Misused as if the whole question of what we did later with hundreds of thousands of men and airplanes and all the rest had been fully validated in a constitutional and politically satisfactory form by a resolution passed in response to a single imperfectly verified episode. That was wrong. And I thought it was wrong at the time and did not prevail at the time. That relatively tricky way of putting in a political base for a large-scale, long-term war came back to haunt the government and the country in later years.
Well, gentlemen, there's much more to be said about this, but we don't have the time to say it tonight, but I'm sure we will as time goes by. Thank you all very much.